Ashley Floor, and you know what I'm talking about here on my channel right now.
Lars Harry here, and today we need to walk through a timeline that honestly changes the way many people have been looking at this entire legal battle involving Blake Lively, Stephanie Jones, and the growing storm surrounding the Van Zandt lawsuit. Because the more you actually read the filings and the judge's rulings, the clearer it becomes that what is happening behind the scenes is not simply a disagreement between professionals in the entertainment industry. Instead, it is turning into a much bigger legal fight about access to private data, the responsibilities of public relations firms, and whether confidential information belonging to clients and employees was weaponized for personal or strategic reasons. And right now, the biggest issue facing Blake Lively and Stephanie Jones is not simply public criticism. It is the possibility that a federal judge may ultimately determine that certain actions taken during this dispute crossed legal lines, especially when it comes to the handling of a phone that belonged to Jen Abel, a publicist connected to Coravanta Studios and individuals working closely with Justin Baldoni and Jamie Heath. To understand why things are becoming so serious, we need to go back to the beginning of the controversy and look carefully at how the narrative surrounding this case originally developed. For months, the public conversation has been dominated by a story that suggested there was a coordinated smear campaign aimed at Blake Lively. According to that version of events, individuals connected to Coravanta were allegedly preparing to damage Lively's reputation in case she ever chose to speak publicly about alleged misconduct that she claimed occurred during the production of the film It Ends With Us. That narrative quickly gained traction because major media outlets began reporting on it, including high-profile publications like the New York Times. Once those reports appeared, the situation escalated quickly. Headlines spread across entertainment media, social media exploded with commentary, and suddenly the public perception of the entire conflict shifted toward the idea that Lively was the victim of a coordinated attempt to undermine her credibility. But when you step away from the headlines and look at the actual legal filings, a very different question begins to emerge. That question centers around how certain information reached journalists in the first place. Because according to court documents and arguments presented in the lawsuit, the material that shaped the public narrative may have come from the contents of Jen Abel's phone. And that raises a critical issue: how exactly was that phone accessed, who obtained the data from it, and whether the people involved had the legal right to do so. This is where the legal battle between Jen Abel and Stephanie Jones becomes extremely important. Abel has argued that her phone was accessed without permission and that the information inside it was extracted and circulated before any formal legal process existed that would have allowed such access. In other words, the claim is that the data was obtained long before any subpoena or court order would have made that action legitimate. If that claim is ultimately proven in court, the implications could be enormous, not only for Jones but also for anyone who later received or used that information. The situation became even more complicated when Judge Lewis Lyman issued a ruling on October 3, 2025. That decision addressed a motion filed by Stephanie Jones asking the court to dismiss the claims brought against her. Motions to dismiss are common in civil litigation. They are essentially requests asking a judge to determine that the plaintiff's allegations are legally insufficient and should not proceed to trial. If a judge grants such a motion, the case can end early. But if the judge denies the motion, the lawsuit continues and the parties move toward discovery and potentially a trial. In this case, Judge Lyman issued a mixed ruling. He granted parts of the motion but denied others, and the sections he refused to dismiss are the ones causing the biggest problems for Jones and potentially for others connected to the situation. Specifically, the judge determined that Jen Abel's allegations under California Penal Code Section 502 were plausible enough to move forward. That statute deals with unauthorized access to computer systems and digital data. In simple terms, it addresses situations where someone knowingly accesses a device or digital system without permission in order to obtain or control information. The judge's reasoning was very detailed, and it addressed several arguments raised by Jones's legal team. One of their key defenses was the claim that Abel's phone belonged to the company or was used for work purposes, suggesting that the employer had broad authority to examine its contents. But the judge did not accept that argument as a basis for dismissing the case. Instead, he explained that the statute does not simply allow employers unlimited access to digital information just because a device is used in a professional context. the law focuses on whether access occurred without permission and whether the person accessing the data knowingly exceeded the authority they actually had. Judge Lyman pointed out that Abel had alleged specific facts suggesting that her messages and data were accessed and shared with others shortly after she left the company. According to the claims described in the ruling, copies of emails and text messages from her phone were circulated among employees at Jones Works. Some of those communications eventually made their way back to Abel, which is how she allegedly became aware that her private data had been viewed and distributed. What made this particularly significant is that the judge noted the timing. The allegation suggested that this access occurred before the Van Zandt lawsuit even existed. In other words, the phone was allegedly being searched and the data extracted before any legal proceeding could justify obtaining that information through formal channels like subpoenas or discovery requests. Another argument raised by Jones's team involved the idea that Abel had not alleged that anyone bypassed technical barriers or security protections when accessing the device. Some previous cases interpreting California's computer access laws have focused on situations where individuals used technical methods to break through security systems. However, Judge Lyman explained that those cases involved very different circumstances. He referenced earlier legal decisions where third-party companies manipulated data on platforms like Facebook after users voluntarily granted them access. In contrast, the situation described by Abel involved something much simpler and potentially more troubling: the allegation that individuals who already possessed the physical phone or had access to her accounts used that position to obtain information they were not authorized to view. The judge noted that the law does not require complicated hacking techniques in order for unauthorized access to occur. Even logging into a system with a valid password can violate the statute if the person using that password does so without permission or for purposes that exceed their authorization. Because of these factors, the judge concluded that Abel's allegations were strong enough to survive the motion to dismiss. At this stage of a case, courts are not deciding whether the claims are ultimately true. Instead, they simply determine whether the allegations, if proven, could establish a legal violation. And Judge Lyman determined that Abel had provided enough factual detail to meet that standard. That decision created a serious problem for Stephanie Jones and her company. If the case proceeds and those allegations are proven, it could mean that confidential data belonging to both an employee and clients was accessed without authorization and then distributed to third parties. For a public relations firm, that kind of finding would be devastating. PR agencies rely entirely on trust. Clients share sensitive information with them, expecting that it will remain confidential and be used only to help manage public messaging. If a court were to conclude that a PR firm misused client information, the damage to its reputation could be catastrophic, and this is where the situation becomes even more complicated for Blake Lively. Because according to counterclaims filed by Coravanta, the confidential information taken from Abel's phone was eventually shared with individuals including Leslie Sloan, Blake Lively, and Ryan Reynolds. Coravanta argues that this disclosure violated the confidentiality provisions in the contract between the studio and Jones Works. That contract reportedly required Jones Works to protect confidential information provided by Coravanta and to use it only for the purpose of performing their public relations services. The agreement allowed disclosure to third parties only when necessary to fulfill those services or when required by law or a court order. Outside of those circumstances, sharing confidential information would constitute a breach of the contract. Coravanta's legal filings claim that Jones Works voluntarily and maliciously disclosed confidential information to third parties who were hostile to the company. They argue that those individuals would not have obtained the information at all if Jones Works had fulfilled its contractual obligation to protect it. According to the lawsuit, the disclosure caused significant damage and may have played a role in shaping the public narrative that later appeared in media reports. If a judge ultimately agrees with those arguments, the consequences could extend far beyond the dispute between Abel and Jones. It could also support Coravanta's claims that their contractual rights were violated and that their confidential information was improperly shared. The judge's earlier ruling about Abel's phone is important here because it already establishes something critical at the pleading stage. The court has acknowledged that it is plausible the phone was accessed without permission and that data from it was distributed before any subpoena existed. That finding does not yet mean the allegations are proven, but it does mean the claims are legally viable and can move forward, and once those allegations move forward, the court will eventually examine how that information was used, who received it, and whether those actions violated contractual obligations or other legal duties. That is precisely why the timeline of events has become so important to understanding what is happening now, because once you place the judge's October 2025 ruling alongside the sequence of lawsuits, amendments, and new allegations being introduced, a pattern begins to appear. And according to critics of Jones and Lively, that pattern suggests a strategy focused on delaying the court from issuing a final ruling on key motions that could confirm the legitimacy of Coravanta's claims. This brings us to the next phase of the legal battle, which involves attempts to amend complaints and introduce new claims into the case. After Abel revised her lawsuit and narrowed the claims she was pursuing, the focus remained heavily on the alleged violation of California Penal Code Section 502. That particular claim is the one that poses the greatest risk for Jones, because it directly addresses the question of unauthorized access to digital data. Rather than allowing the case to move forward toward a ruling on the existing motions, Jones sought to add new allegations and expand the scope of the litigation. Those proposed changes included claims involving recorded phone calls, accusations about the creation of smear websites, and attempts to bring additional individuals into the dispute. Critics argue that these new claims function as distractions that complicate the case and delay decisions the judge might otherwise issue. From a legal strategy perspective, amendments can sometimes be legitimate. Lawsuits evolve as new information emerges, and courts often allow parties to modify their claims. However, judges also consider timing and fairness. When a party attempts to significantly alter a case long after deadlines for amendments have passed, courts may question whether the request is being made in good faith or simply as a tactic to delay proceedings. In this situation, opponents of Jones argue that the attempt to introduce new allegations came only after the judge issued a ruling that placed her legal position in jeopardy. By expanding the case and involving additional parties, the litigation could become more complex and take longer to resolve. That delay might postpone any final determination about whether the phone was accessed without authorization and whether confidential information was improperly shared. For Blake Lively, the stakes are also extremely high. If the court ultimately determines that the information she received originated from unauthorized access to Abel's phone, it could undermine the narrative that initially shaped public opinion about the dispute. Instead of focusing on an alleged smear campaign against her, the conversation could shift toward whether she benefited from data that should never have been obtained or distributed in the first place. And once legal accountability enters the picture, public relations strategies become far less effective. Courts rely on evidence, documents, and sworn testimony. Media narratives cannot change what those records reveal. That is why many observers believe the current stage of the litigation is essentially a race between two forces: the legal process moving forward and the ongoing effort to control the public narrative surrounding the case. Right now, both dynamics are unfolding at the same time. Court filings continue to accumulate, motions are being argued, and the judge must eventually decide whether the claims filed by Coravanta and Abel will proceed toward trial. Meanwhile, articles and commentary continue appearing in entertainment media, often presenting very different interpretations of what is happening. But as we move further into this legal battle, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The outcome may depend less on public opinion and more on the timeline of events that the court ultimately establishes. Who accessed the phone, when it happened, what information was taken, and how that information was used are the questions that will determine whether the actions described in these lawsuits were lawful or not. And if the court concludes that unauthorized access occurred and that confidential information was shared improperly, the consequences could reshape not only this dispute but also the careers and reputations of the people involved. That is why the attempts to delay rulings, amend complaints, and introduce new allegations have drawn so much attention from legal observers, because sometimes in complex litigation, the most important battle is not about winning immediately. It is about buying time. Now, continuing from where we left off, the situation becomes even more complicated when you examine what happened after the judge issued that critical ruling acknowledging that Jen Abel had plausibly alleged unauthorized access to her phone. That single determination, even though it was only made at the pleading stage, sent shockwaves through the entire legal structure surrounding the dispute. Because once the court recognized that the allegations about the phone were legally plausible, it created a domino effect that could potentially validate multiple other claims that had been filed in related litigation. From a legal standpoint, that ruling placed Stephanie Jones in a very uncomfortable position. If the case were allowed to proceed without interruption, the court would eventually examine the entire sequence of events that followed the alleged access to Abel's phone. That means investigators, attorneys, and potentially a jury would begin asking questions about exactly how the information inside the device moved from one person to another. Who saw the messages first? Who decided to distribute them? Who ultimately received them? And most importantly, what purpose did that information serve once it began circulating outside the original device? Those questions become even more serious when you consider the contractual obligations that existed between Coravanta and Jones Works. According to filings in the case, Coravanta had hired Jones Works as a public relations firm to provide strategic communication services. In the entertainment industry, that kind of relationship requires a high degree of confidentiality. Studios frequently share sensitive internal information with PR teams so they can anticipate media questions, manage public perception, and protect projects from damaging leaks. Because of that, PR contracts typically contain strict clauses requiring the agency to protect any confidential information it receives. In this particular agreement, the language reportedly made it very clear that Jones Works was required to keep confidential information private and use it only for the purposes of performing its services for Coravanta. The contract also allowed disclosure in very limited circumstances, such as when sharing information with legal representatives or when complying with a lawful subpoena or court order. Outside of those situations, distributing confidential information to third parties would constitute a breach of the agreement. Coravanta's counterclaims argue that exactly such a breach occurred. According to their legal filings, Jones Works disclosed confidential information to individuals who were not authorized to receive it, including people who were in direct conflict with Coravanta at the time. Those individuals allegedly included Leslie Sloan, Blake Lively, and Ryan Reynolds. The studio claims that this disclosure was not accidental or unavoidable but instead voluntary and malicious, meaning it was done intentionally and with knowledge that it could harm the company. If a court ultimately agrees with that interpretation, the consequences could extend far beyond a typical contract dispute. It would suggest that a PR firm entrusted with protecting a client's reputation instead used confidential information against that client. For any communications agency, that kind of finding would be catastrophic because the entire business model of public relations depends on trust. Clients must believe that their advisors will handle sensitive information responsibly and will never turn it into a weapon. The legal theory behind Coravanta's claims does not stop with breach of contract. The company has also alleged that Jones violated what is known as the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing. That principle exists in many contracts under American law and essentially means that both parties must act honestly and not undermine the purpose of the agreement. Even if a contract does not explicitly forbid a particular action, a party can still violate this covenant if their behavior prevents the other side from receiving the benefits they expected from the agreement. In this case, Coravanta argues that they fulfilled their own obligations under the contract by paying Jones Works and providing the information necessary for the firm to perform its services. However, they claim that Jones acted against their interests by distributing confidential material to people who were hostile toward the studio. According to the lawsuit, this conduct deprived Coravanta of the very protection and strategic support they hired the PR firm to provide. The reason this matters so much now is that Judge Lyman's earlier ruling about the phone indirectly strengthens these claims. By acknowledging that Abel plausibly alleged unauthorized access to her device, the court has already indicated that the information in question may have been obtained improperly. If that data later traveled to third parties through Jones Works, it becomes easier for Coravanta to argue that the PR firm violated both its contractual duties and the implied covenant of good faith. Faced with that possibility, Stephanie Jones appears to have taken steps that critics describe as an attempt to reshape the battlefield. After Abel amended her complaint and narrowed the claims she was pursuing, Jones responded by seeking to expand the litigation in a different direction. She proposed adding new allegations involving other individuals connected to the dispute and introducing claims related to recorded phone calls and alleged smear campaigns conducted through websites. One of the most notable elements of this strategy involves accusations directed at Melissa Nathan. According to Jones's filings, Nathan is alleged to have created or orchestrated multiple websites designed to attack individuals involved in the dispute. The claims suggest that these sites were part of a coordinated effort to spread damaging narratives and influence public perception of the case. However, critics of Jones argue that these allegations function as a distraction from the central issue that the judge has already identified, the alleged unauthorized access to Abel's phone. By introducing new claims and new defendants, the litigation becomes far more complicated. Additional discovery would be required, more motions would need to be filed, and the timeline for resolving the original claims could be pushed further into the future. In complex civil litigation, this type of maneuver is sometimes referred to as procedural delay. It does not necessarily mean that the new claims are false or invalid. But it does mean that the case expands in ways that make it more difficult for a judge to quickly rule on the issues that were originally presented. Every new allegation creates new questions, and each of those questions must be addressed before the court can move forward. From the perspective of someone trying to avoid an unfavorable ruling, delay can be valuable. The longer a case remains unresolved, the more opportunities exist to shape public perception, negotiate settlements, or uncover information that might strengthen one's legal position. In some situations, the delay itself can even reduce public interest in the dispute, allowing parties to quietly resolve the matter outside the spotlight. This is why the current stage of the litigation has been described by some observers as a kind of legal purgatory. The core allegations remain unresolved, yet the case continues to grow more complicated. Motions are filed, responses are submitted, and hearings are scheduled, but the final determination about the most critical issues has not yet been made. For Blake Lively, this environment carries both risks and advantages. On one hand, the delay provides time to manage public messaging and respond to developments as they occur. On the other hand, every new court filing adds to the record that journalists, commentators, and legal analysts examine. If damaging information appears in those filings, it can quickly become part of the broader narrative surrounding the case. The situation became even more intense when previously sealed documents began to emerge in related proceedings. Once those materials became available, they introduced new details about the internal conflicts surrounding the film production and the individuals involved in managing its publicity. Some of those revelations challenged the earlier narrative that had dominated media coverage. Instead of focusing exclusively on alleged misconduct by Justin Baldoni or others connected to Coravanta, new reports began examining the role played by Lively herself during the production of the film. Stories appeared suggesting that she had significant influence over creative decisions and may have taken control of aspects of the project that were not originally within her authority. At the same time, criticism also began to focus on Ryan Reynolds, with some accounts describing his involvement in the production as unusually aggressive or disruptive. Whether those descriptions are accurate remains a matter of debate, but their appearance in the public conversation illustrates how quickly narratives can shift when legal documents become available. Once filings are placed on the court docket, they become part of the public record, and reporters can examine them in detail. That process often reveals information that had previously been hidden behind confidentiality agreements or sealed records. For Stephanie Jones, the risk is similar. If the case proceeds and evidence is presented supporting the allegation that she accessed Abel's phone without permission, it could fundamentally damage her credibility as a public relations professional. Clients depend on PR advisors to handle sensitive communications responsibly. A finding that confidential information was misused would raise serious concerns about whether future clients could trust the firm with their own data. The impact could extend even further if the court determines that the information extracted from the phone played a role in shaping media coverage of the dispute. Because if journalists received that information without knowing how it was obtained, it raises questions about whether the reporting was influenced by material that should never have been circulated in the first place. This is one reason the narrative battle surrounding the case has been so intense. Both sides understand that public perception can influence everything from business relationships to settlement negotiations. Controlling the narrative does not change the facts that a judge will eventually examine, but it can affect how those facts are interpreted by the broader public. As the litigation continues, the central conflict remains the same: whether the information that fueled the early stages of the controversy was obtained and distributed lawfully. Everything else in the case, claims about smear campaigns, accusations involving websites, and disputes over recorded conversations, ultimately circles back to that original question, and that is why the timeline matters so much. If the court determines that Jones accessed Abel's phone before any subpoena existed and then shared the data with third parties, the entire structure of the narrative built around the alleged smear campaign could collapse. Instead of showing that Lively was the target of an orchestrated attack, the evidence might suggest that she benefited from information that was obtained improperly. Of course, none of those outcomes are guaranteed. Civil litigation is unpredictable, and cases often take unexpected turns as new evidence emerges. Judges may grant or deny motions that change the course of the dispute, and parties sometimes reach settlements that end the litigation before a final ruling is issued, but the stakes in this case remain extremely high for everyone involved. For Coravanta, the goal is to prove that their confidential information was mishandled and that their contractual rights were violated. For Jen Abel, the focus is on demonstrating that her private phone data was accessed without permission and used in ways that harmed her personally and professionally. For Stephanie Jones, the objective is to challenge those allegations and avoid findings that could destroy her firm's reputation, and for Blake Lively, the outcome may determine whether the story that originally defined this controversy continues to hold up under legal scrutiny. At the moment, the case remains in motion, with filings continuing to appear and arguments still being made before the court. But one thing seems increasingly clear: the legal process is slowly cutting through the public relations narratives that once dominated the conversation. When the final rulings eventually arrive, they will not be based on headlines, social media debates, or competing press statements. They will be based on evidence, testimony, and the law, and that is exactly why so many people are watching this case so closely. Because once the court finishes examining the timeline and the facts surrounding Jen Abel's phone, the answers it provides could reshape the entire story that the public has been hearing from the beginning. For now, the litigation continues, the motions keep coming, and the timeline grows longer. But if the pattern identified by observers is correct, the current strategy may simply be about buying time until the moment when the legal system delivers the final word, and when that moment comes, it could change everything.